The words hit the table like a bomb. Around our family's monthly brunch table, the gentle chatter of silverware on china stopped abruptly as my daughter Sophia rose from her chair with the kind of theatrical confidence that meant she'd been planning this moment for weeks. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice carrying across the sun-drenched terrace of what had been our family's Napa Valley villa for 3 generations. "I've given the villa to my husband's parents. Roberto's family will be taking possession next month." What none of us knew, including Sophia herself, was that she'd just set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets, test loyalties, and ultimately reveal who truly held the power in our family. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about a house or family drama. It's about what happens when love, loyalty, and legacy collide in ways that no one sees coming. The Villa Rosalinda had been in our family since 1952, when my grandmother Rosa Benedetti purchased 40 acres of Napa Valley vineyard with money she'd saved working as a seamstress in San Francisco's North Beach. Rosa was a first-generation Italian immigrant who understood that in America, land meant security, and security meant your children would have opportunities you never had. She named the property Villa Rosalinda, a combination of her own name and that of her mother, Linda, who had died in Italy before Rosa could bring her to America. The villa started as a simple farmhouse, but over the decades, Rosa and my grandfather Antonio expanded it into a beautiful Mediterranean-style estate with terraced gardens, a working vineyard, and guest quarters that could accommodate the large family gatherings that were central to Rosa's vision of American success. My mother, Elena, inherited the villa when Rosa passed away in 1978, and she continued the tradition of using it as the heart of our family's social life. Every major holiday, birthday, and celebration was held at Villa Rosalinda, and the house became synonymous with family unity and continuity. When my mother died 5 years ago, she left the villa to me, her only child, with the understanding that I would continue the family tradition of maintaining it as a gathering place for future generations. At 62, I was recently retired from my career as a high school principal, and I'd been looking forward to spending more time at the villa, perhaps even moving there permanently. But life, as I was learning, rarely follows the plans we make. My daughter Sophia, now 34, had always been the most ambitious of my 3 children. She'd graduated from Stanford with a degree in international business, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had built a successful career in luxury hotel management. She was intelligent, driven, and beautiful, with the kind of confidence that opened doors and commanded attention wherever she went. 3 years ago, Sophia had married Roberto Castellani, the son of a wealthy Italian family who owned a chain of boutique hotels throughout Europe. The wedding had been held at Villa Rosalinda, naturally, with 200 guests celebrating under string lights in the vineyard, while a string quartet played Italian love songs that would have made Rosa weep with joy. Roberto was charming, sophisticated, and undeniably devoted to Sophia. He spoke perfect English, with just enough of an Italian accent to seem romantic rather than foreign, and he fit into our family gatherings with the kind of effortless grace that suggested he genuinely enjoyed being part of our loud, affectionate, sometimes chaotic family dynamic. His parents, Marcello and Francesca Castellani, were a different story. I'd met them several times over the past 3 years, and while they were always polite, there was an underlying coolness in their interactions with our family that suggested they viewed the marriage as something Roberto had chosen, despite his better judgment, rather than because of it. Marcello was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s who carried himself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He spoke in measured, formal sentences that made even casual conversation feel like a business negotiation, and he had a habit of looking just slightly over your shoulder when you talked to him, as if he were scanning for more interesting company. Francesca was elegant in the way that only comes from generations of wealth and social position. She wore understated but obviously expensive clothes, carried herself with the kind of refined grace that suggested finishing school, and had perfected the art of the polite smile that conveyed absolutely no warmth or genuine interest. During family gatherings, the Castellanis would participate in conversations with the kind of careful courtesy that felt more like diplomatic protocol than genuine engagement. They would compliment the food, admire the vineyard, and ask polite questions about our family history. But there was always a sense that they were observing rather than participating, studying rather than enjoying. "They think we're beneath them," my son Marcus had said to me privately after the wedding. "They're polite about it, but you can tell they think Roberto married down." At the time, I'd dismissed Marcus's observation as sibling protectiveness. Marcus was 2 years younger than Sophia, and had always been somewhat resentful of the attention her achievements garnered. I'd assumed his criticism of the Castellanis was more about his complicated relationship with his sister than about any real problems with Roberto's family. But as the years passed, I began to see what Marcus had noticed from the beginning. The Castellanis never reciprocated invitations to our family gatherings by inviting us to their events. When Roberto and Sofia visited Italy, we would see photos on social media of elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings that clearly didn't include Sofia, despite the fact that she was supposedly becoming part of their family. More troubling, Sofia herself began to change after her marriage, in ways that seemed designed to distance herself from her own background and align herself more closely with Roberto's family's expectations. She started correcting people who mispronounced Italian words, even when those people included her own siblings who had grown up hearing the same family stories and recipes that she had. She began referring to Villa Rosalinda as quaint and rustic, in a way that suggested she was seeing it through new, more critical eyes. Most significantly, she started talking about the need for our family to elevate itself, to become more sophisticated and internationally minded in a way that would allow us to move in the same social circles as Roberto's family. The Castellanis know people all over Europe, Sofia would say during family dinners. They have connections in Paris, London, Milan. Roberto could help Marcus and David with their businesses if we approach this right. The implication that our family needed to approach this right to be worthy of the Castellani's assistance was insulting, but I tried to give Sofia the benefit of the doubt. Marriage requires adjustment and compromise, and I assumed she was simply trying to navigate the complex dynamics of blending two very different family cultures. But the changes in Sofia went deeper than cultural adjustment. She began criticizing aspects of our family life that she'd previously cherished. Our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, which had always been a casual, joyful celebration, where everyone contributed dishes and stories, suddenly became disorganized and lacking in proper presentation. The monthly family brunches at Villa Rosalinda, which had been my mother's tradition and which I'd continued as a way of maintaining family connections, were now too frequent and exhausting for Sofia, who began attending sporadically and leaving early when she did come. "We need to be more intentional about our gatherings," she told me during one particularly uncomfortable conversation. "Quality over quantity. The Castellanis only host dinner parties when they have something meaningful to celebrate, and their guests always know they're attending something special." The criticism stung because it suggested that our family traditions that had been meaningful to 3 generations of women, were somehow inadequate compared to whatever model the Castellanis represented. My younger son David, who was 30 and worked as a chef in San Francisco, was even more direct in his assessment of the situation. "Sofia's embarrassed by us," he said bluntly during one of our private conversations. "She's married into money and sophistication, and now she thinks everything about our family is too loud, too ethnic, too working class for her new image." I tried to defend Sofia, but David's observation was difficult to argue with. Sofia seemed to be conducting a systematic critique of our family culture, finding it wanting when measured against the standards she'd absorbed from her marriage to Roberto. The breaking point came 6 months ago, during our annual 4th of July celebration at Villa Rosalinda. The party had always been one of our biggest gatherings, with extended family, close friends, and neighbors joining us for an all-day celebration that included swimming, bocce ball, a huge barbecue, and fireworks over the vineyard. Roberto and Sofia arrived 2 hours late, just as we were serving dinner. Sofia was wearing a white linen dress that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly salary, and Roberto was in perfectly pressed khakis and a polo shirt that screamed expensive casual. They moved through the party like visiting dignitaries, politely sampling food, making brief conversation with relatives, and maintaining the kind of gracious but distant demeanor that suggested they were fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying a celebration. The moment that crystallized everything happened during dinner, when my Aunt Carmela was telling one of her famous stories about Rosa's early days in San Francisco. Aunt Carmela was in her 80s and had a gift for storytelling that always captivated the family, especially the younger generation who loved hearing about their great-grandmother's adventures as a young immigrant. "So Rosa is working at this fancy house in Pacific Heights," Aunt Carmela was saying, "and the lady of the house tells her that the way she's ironing the tablecloths isn't sophisticated enough for their dinner parties." Sofia interrupted with a laugh that sounded more dismissive than amused. "Oh, Aunt Carmela, those old stories are so quaint. I'm sure Rosa did her best, but times were so different then." The word quaint hung in the air like an insult. Aunt Carmela's face fell, and I could see the hurt in her eyes as she realized that her great-niece was essentially dismissing the family history that had always been a source of pride and connection. "Those stories aren't quaint," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "They're our heritage. Rosa built everything we have starting from nothing, and her struggles and successes are what created the opportunities that all of us, including you, have benefited from." Sofia waved dismissively at Marcus's words. "Of course I'm grateful for what Rosa accomplished, but we don't have to keep dwelling on the past. We can honor our heritage while also evolving and growing beyond it." The phrase "growing beyond it" was the final straw for me. The implication that our family heritage was something to be transcended rather than treasured revealed how completely Sophia's values had shifted since her marriage. "Our heritage isn't something to grow beyond," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had just reached the end of her patience. "It's something to build upon. Rosa didn't sacrifice and struggle so that her descendants could become embarrassed by where they came from." Sophia's response was defensive and revealing. "I'm not embarrassed by our family, but I think we can aspire to something more elegant, more refined. The Castellanis have shown me what's possible when a family commits to excellence and sophistication." The comparison was implicit, but unmistakable. The Castellanis represented excellence and sophistication, while our family represented something that needed to be improved upon or left behind. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Sophia and Roberto leaving early, and the rest of the family spending the evening processing what had just happened. It was clear that Sophia's marriage hadn't just brought a new person into our family. It had fundamentally changed how she saw herself in relation to the rest of us. Over the following months, Sophia's attendance at family gatherings became even more sporadic, and when she did attend, she seemed distracted and slightly impatient, as if she were fulfilling an obligation rather than spending time with people she loved. She started talking about Roberto's work requiring more travel, about opportunities in Europe that might require them to relocate, about the need to be strategic about their time and commitments, in ways that suggested our family gatherings were no longer a priority. Most troubling, she began making comments about Villa Rosalinda that suggested she was viewing it as more of a burden than a blessing. "It's such a big property to maintain," she would say, "and it's so far from everything. I don't know how you manage all the upkeep and expense." At the time, I'd assumed she was expressing concern for my well-being as I aged and potentially faced challenges maintaining such a large property on my own. But looking back, I realized she was probably conducting a kind of reconnaissance, assessing the property's value and potential for other uses. Which brings us to this morning's family brunch, the monthly gathering that Sophia had attended reluctantly for the past year, and which had become increasingly tense as her priorities shifted away from family and toward her new life with Roberto. The brunch had started normally enough. Marcus and his wife Jennifer had arrived with their 2 young children, who immediately ran off to play in the vineyard. David had brought his girlfriend Sarah, who was helping him prepare a new menu for his restaurant. My sister Maria and her husband Tony had driven up from San Jose, and various cousins and family friends had filled out the usual crowd of 15 or 20 people. Sophia and Roberto had arrived precisely on time, which was actually unusual for a family gathering where people typically wandered in over the course of an hour or so. They were both dressed more formally than the occasion required, Sophia in a tailored blazer and designer jeans, Roberto in a button-down shirt and slacks that looked like they'd been professionally pressed that morning. During the first hour of the gathering, they'd maintained polite conversation with various family members, but I'd noticed that they seemed distracted, frequently making eye contact with each other in a way that suggested they were preparing for something. That something became clear when Sophia stood up as we were finishing the main course, tapping her water glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "I have an announcement to make," she said, her voice carrying the kind of studied confidence that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment multiple times. The conversation around the table stopped, and everyone turned to look at her with the kind of expectant attention that announcements at family gatherings typically receive. I assumed she was going to tell us about a pregnancy, a promotion, or travel plans. Instead, she delivered the words that would change everything. "Roberto and I have made a decision about Villa Rosalinda," she said, pausing dramatically to make sure she had everyone's complete attention. "We've decided that the property would be much better utilized by Roberto's parents, who have extensive experience managing luxury properties in Europe. I've given the villa to Marcello and Francesca. They'll be taking possession next month and converting it into a boutique hotel and event space." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe as the implications of Sophia's announcement sank in. Then the room erupted. Marcus was the first to find his voice, his chair scraping against the terrace stones as he shot to his feet with a force that made the entire table shake. "What the hell do you mean you gave away the villa?" he shouted, his face flushing red with a combination of shock and rage that I'd never seen from my usually level-headed son. "You can't just give away property that doesn't belong to you." Sophia remained standing, her posture rigid with defensive determination, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes that suggested she hadn't expected quite this level of explosive reaction. "The villa was left to me in Mom's will," she said, her voice taking on the condescending tone she'd developed over the past few years. "I have every legal right to decide what happens to it." The words hit me like a physical blow, not just because of their content, but because of their casual dismissal of everything the villa represented to our family. But more than that, there was something fundamentally wrong with what Sophia was claiming. "Sophia," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I was feeling. The villa wasn't left to you. It was left to me when Grandma Elena died. Sophia's confident expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mom, you're getting older, and managing such a large property is becoming too much for you. I'm simply taking responsibility for family assets before they become a burden you can't handle. The patronizing tone was infuriating, but it was David who articulated what everyone at the table was thinking. You're lying, he said bluntly, his chef's knife still in his hand from cutting fruit, which somehow made his words seem more ominous. Mom inherited the villa 5 years ago, and there's been no transfer of ownership since then. You can't give away property you don't own. Roberto spoke for the first time since Sophia's announcement, his accent seeming more pronounced than usual, as he attempted to project calm authority over the increasingly volatile situation. I think there has been some confusion about the legal arrangements, he said with the diplomatic tone of someone who was used to managing difficult negotiations. Sophia has been working with our family's attorneys to ensure that the villa's transition to my parents' management is handled properly and legally. My sister Maria, who had been silent until now, leaned forward with the sharp focus of someone who had spent 30 years as a paralegal and knew exactly what questions to ask. What attorneys? She demanded. What legal documents? If there's been a transfer of ownership, there would be a paper trail. And I can guarantee you that my sister hasn't signed anything transferring the villa to anyone. The challenge seemed to catch both Sophia and Roberto off guard, and I could see them exchanging glances that suggested their carefully planned announcement was not going according to script. The paperwork is being handled by the Castellani family's legal team, Sophia said, but her voice lacked the confidence she'd displayed moments earlier. Everything will be finalized properly. Bullshit, Marcus said, his anger now focused and controlled in a way that was somehow more intimidating than his initial explosion. You can't transfer property without the owner's consent, and Mom clearly hasn't consented to anything. What you're describing isn't a legal transfer, it's theft. The word theft hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see several family members nodding in agreement with Marcus's assessment. But it was my Aunt Carmela, the elderly storyteller whom Sophia had dismissed so casually just months earlier, who asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Sophia, cara mia, she said in the gentle but penetrating voice that had been extracting truth from family members for 8 decades. Why do you want to give away the place where your great-grandmother built her American dream? Why do you want to turn Rosa's home into a business for strangers? The question was asked with such genuine sadness and confusion that it seemed to pierce through Sophia's defensive armor in a way that the anger and accusations hadn't managed to do. For the first time since her announcement, Sophia looked genuinely uncomfortable, even vulnerable. Aunt Carmela, she said, her voice softer but still defensive. Rosa would have wanted the villa to be used to its full potential. She was a businesswoman who understood the value of making smart decisions about assets. Rosa was a businesswoman who bought this land so her family would always have a place to come home to, I said, finding my voice and feeling the strength of 3 generations of women who had fought to preserve what we'd built. She didn't buy it as an investment. She bought it as a legacy. Roberto attempted to regain control of the conversation with the kind of measured corporate speak that probably served him well in business settings, but felt completely tone-deaf in the context of a family crisis. With respect, Mrs. Benedetti, he said, addressing me with formal politeness that felt like a distancing tactic. The hospitality industry has evolved significantly since Rosa's time. My parents have extensive experience in luxury property management, and they could transform Villa Rosalinda into a destination that would honor your family's heritage while generating significant revenue. The phrase, generating significant revenue, revealed everything about Roberto's motivations, and probably explained a great deal about the influence he'd been having on Sophia's thinking about the villa. We don't want revenue from Rosa's home, David said, his voice tight with disgust. We want it to remain Rosa's home, where her family gathers and her memory is honored every time we break bread together at her table. Jennifer, Marcus's wife, spoke up for the first time since the announcement, her voice shaking with emotion. Sophia, your grandmother Elena specifically told me that she was leaving the villa to your mother because she trusted her to keep it in the family. She made me promise to help ensure that the monthly brunches and holiday gatherings would continue so that the children, your children when you have them, would grow up knowing their heritage the way you did. The mention of future children seemed to strike Sophia in a way that the other arguments hadn't, and I could see her composure cracking slightly. But before she could respond, Roberto placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive but felt controlling. My parents aren't strangers, he said firmly. They're Sophia's family now, and they understand the importance of honoring heritage while also making practical decisions about property management. The possessive way Roberto spoke about Sophia's decisions, and the dismissive way he characterized our concerns as impractical, finally pushed me past the point of polite disagreement. Roberto, I said, standing up and facing him directly across the table. The Castellanis are not Sophia's family in any way that gives them rights to property that belongs to me and has been in my family for 70 years. And this conversation is not about property management. It's about a young woman who seems to have forgotten where she came from and who she really is. The directness of my challenge seemed to surprise Roberto, who had probably become accustomed to having his opinions treated with deference and respect. "Mrs. Benedetti," he said, his diplomatic mask slipping slightly to reveal something colder underneath. "I think you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment about what's best for everyone involved. And I think you're allowing greed to cloud your judgment about what belongs to you and what doesn't." Marcus shot back, stepping closer to Roberto in a way that suggested the conversation was about to become physical. Sophia quickly moved between them, her hands raised in a gesture that was meant to be calming, but which seemed more frantic than controlled. "Stop it," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was losing her grip on the situation. "This is exactly why we need to make changes. This family can't have a civil conversation about important decisions without turning everything into a dramatic confrontation. The accusation that our family was somehow dysfunctional for objecting to her plan to give away our ancestral home was so tone-deaf that it left everyone temporarily speechless. It was my cousin Tony who finally broke the silence with a question that exposed the practical flaws in whatever scheme Sophia and Roberto had concocted. "Even if you wanted to do this," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism, "how exactly were you planning to transfer property that doesn't belong to you? Did you think you could just hand over the keys and hope nobody noticed?" The question seemed to fluster both Sophia and Roberto, and their exchanged glances suggested that they hadn't fully thought through the legal mechanics of their plan. "The transfer would be handled through proper legal channels," Roberto said vaguely, but his tone lacked conviction. "What legal channels?" Maria pressed, her paralegal training making her particularly effective at exposing gaps in their story. "You can't deed property without the owner's signature, and you can't forge ownership documents without committing felony fraud." The word fraud seemed to hit Roberto like a slap, and for the first time since the conversation began, he looked genuinely concerned rather than just frustrated. "We're not talking about fraud," he said quickly. "We're talking about family arrangements that would be formalized through appropriate legal processes." "What family arrangements?" I demanded, my patience finally exhausted. "What exactly have you been told about the ownership of this property, and who told you that you had any right to make decisions about it?" For the first time since her announcement, Sophia looked genuinely uncertain, even confused, as if she was beginning to realize that her understanding of the situation might be fundamentally flawed. "Roberto's parents said that since I'm your only daughter, and since you're getting older, it would be natural for me to take responsibility for family assets," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The admission revealed a great deal about how this plan had developed and who had been driving it. "Sophia," I said gently, trying to reach the daughter I remembered beneath the person she'd become. "I'm 62 years old, not 92. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own property, and I haven't given anyone, including you, any indication that I'm ready to transfer ownership of anything." "But you will eventually," Roberto interjected, apparently trying to regain control of an argument that was slipping away from him. "And when that time comes, it makes sense to have arrangements in place that would benefit everyone involved." "Everyone involved?" David repeated incredulously. "You mean everyone involved in your parents' hotel business? I don't see how turning our family home into a commercial enterprise benefits anyone in this family." Roberto's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about our family's values and priorities. The revenue generated by a luxury hospitality operation would provide financial security for all of Sophia's relatives, he said, as if he were offering us a generous gift, rather than proposing to steal our heritage. "My parents' expertise in the industry would ensure maximum profitability." The casual way Roberto discussed turning Villa Rosalinda into a luxury hospitality operation for maximum profitability showed how completely he'd missed the point of what the property meant to our family. "We don't want maximum profitability," I said, my voice carrying the finality of someone who had reached the end of a very long rope. "We want maximum family connection. We want our children and grandchildren to grow up knowing where they come from. We want to honor the woman who sacrificed everything to give us this place to call home." Sophia looked around the table at the faces of family members who were staring at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to anger, to genuine confusion about who she had become. "You're all being so dramatic about this," she said, but her voice was beginning to crack with something that might have been doubt. "The Castellanis aren't trying to steal anything. They're trying to help our family make better use of valuable assets." "Whose valuable assets?" Marcus demanded. "The villa belongs to Mom, not to you, and certainly not to your husband's parents. What exactly made you think you had the right to make decisions about property that isn't yours?" For the first time since her announcement, Sophia seemed to genuinely struggle for an answer, and I could see her looking to Roberto for support that wasn't forthcoming. Roberto was staring at his plate, apparently realizing that his attempt to manipulate our family dynamics had gone very badly wrong, and that he was facing potential legal consequences for his role in whatever scheme he and his parents had devised. It was in this moment of uncomfortable silence that I decided to reveal something that would change the entire dynamic of the confrontation and expose just how poorly Roberto and his parents had understood the situation they were trying to manipulate. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a folder of documents I'd brought to this brunch for an entirely different purpose. "There's something I need to tell all of you about the villa's ownership status." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was charged with curiosity rather than anger. "I've been planning to make an announcement of my own today," I continued, looking around the table at my family members who were now staring at me with rapt attention, "about some changes I've been making to my estate planning." I opened the folder and pulled out several legal documents that I'd had prepared over the past month by my attorney. "As of last week," I said, my voice steady and clear, "Villa Rosalinda is no longer owned by me alone. I've transferred ownership to a family trust that includes all 3 of my children as equal beneficiaries." The revelation hit the table like a second bomb, but this time Sophia was the one who looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means," I said, looking directly at her, "that you can't give away the villa even if you wanted to, because you only own 1/3 of it. Any major decisions about the property now require unanimous agreement from all 3 trustees." I turned to look at Marcus and David, both of whom were staring at me with expressions of surprise and growing understanding. "And it means," I continued, "that your brothers now have legal authority to block any attempts to transfer, sell, or otherwise dispose of family property without their consent." The implications of this revelation were immediately clear to everyone at the table. Sophia's grand gesture of giving away the villa was not only legally impossible, it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of her position within the family hierarchy. But more than that, it meant that Roberto and his parents had been planning to steal property that didn't belong to Sophia in the first place, and they'd based their entire scheme on assumptions that were completely wrong. As the family began to process this new information, I could see Sophia's face cycling through a series of emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally something that looked like the beginning of understanding about just how badly she'd been manipulated. The real confrontation was just beginning. Sophia sank back into her chair as if the weight of my revelation had physically knocked her down. Her face had gone pale, and for the first time since her marriage to Roberto, I saw glimpses of the uncertain young woman she'd been before she'd convinced herself that sophistication meant rejecting everything she'd grown up with. "Mom," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rustling through the vineyard. Why didn't you tell me about the trust?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, but it was Roberto's reaction that really caught my attention. Instead of looking surprised or disappointed by this turn of events, he looked angry, the kind of cold, calculated anger that suggested this news was more than just an inconvenience to his plans. "This changes nothing," Roberto said, his diplomatic mask finally slipping completely to reveal something much harder underneath. "A family trust can be dissolved if the beneficiaries agree to different arrangements. My parents' offer to manage the property would benefit everyone involved." The presumption in his statement, that he could simply negotiate his way around our family's legal protections, was breathtaking in its arrogance. Marcus stood up from the table, his jaw set with the kind of determination that I recognized from his teenage years when he'd decided to fight for something he believed in. "Let me make this very clear," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just realized he held more power in this situation than he'd understood. "I will never, under any circumstances, agree to transfer any portion of Villa Rosalinda to your parents or anyone else outside our family." David nodded in immediate agreement. "Same here. This property stays in our family, period." Roberto's face darkened with frustration, and when he spoke, his accent became more pronounced in a way that suggested he was struggling to maintain control over his emotions. "You are making a mistake," he said, directing his words to Marcus and David, but clearly intending them for me as well. "My parents have resources and connections that could transform this property into something much more valuable than a simple family gathering place." "More valuable to whom?" David shot back. "More valuable to your parents' hotel empire? Because it's already invaluable to us as the place where our great-grandmother built her American dream." The mention of Rosa seemed to trigger something in Sophia, who had been sitting in stunned silence since my revelation about the trust. "Stop throwing Rosa in my face," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "I loved Nonna Rosa just as much as any of you, but that doesn't mean we have to keep everything exactly the same forever. People evolve, families grow, and sometimes that means making changes." "What kind of changes?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Sophia had convinced herself that giving away our family heritage constituted growth rather than abandonment. Sophia looked around the table at the faces of family members who were waiting for her to explain herself, and I could see her struggling to articulate something that went beyond the surface justifications she'd been offering. "The Castellanis have shown me what's possible when a family thinks bigger than just this," she said, gesturing around the terrace in a way that encompassed not just the villa, but everything it represented. "They have properties all over Europe, connections with important people, opportunities to build something that matters on an international scale." The phrase, "something that matters," hung in the air like an insult to 3 generations of women who had poured their hearts into making Villa Rosalinda matter to the people who loved it. "What we have here doesn't matter?" Jennifer asked, her voice thick with emotion. "The place where your grandmother taught you to make pasta doesn't matter. The vineyard where your grandfather taught Marcus to prune vines doesn't matter. The kitchen where 4 generations of women have shared recipes and stories doesn't matter." Sophia's response revealed just how completely her values had shifted since her marriage. "Of course those things were meaningful," she said with the kind of dismissive patience that adults use with children who don't understand complicated situations. "But they're memories now. We can't live in the past forever." "We're not living in the past," Maria said, her voice sharp with anger. "We're building on the past. There's a difference between honoring your heritage and being trapped by it." Roberto attempted to regain control of the conversation by appealing to what he clearly assumed were our materialistic motivations. "The Castellani family's hotel operation would generate millions of dollars in revenue annually," he said, as if he were offering us a gift rather than proposing to steal our home. "That income could be distributed among family members, providing financial security for everyone." The suggestion that we needed financial security from his parents was particularly galling, since most of us were doing perfectly well without their assistance. "We don't need millions of dollars," I said firmly. "We need a place where our family can continue to gather, where our children can learn where they came from, where the traditions that Rosa started can be passed down to future generations." Roberto's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about our family's priorities, and probably explained a great deal about the advice he'd been giving Sophia. "Tradition doesn't pay for college educations or medical bills or retirement," he said with the tone of someone who thought he was being practical rather than insulting. "Sentiment is a luxury that families can't afford when there are real financial opportunities available." The characterization of our family's connection to Villa Rosalinda as sentiment and luxury showed just how completely Roberto had missed the point of what we were fighting to preserve. But it was Aunt Carmela who delivered the response that cut through Roberto's corporate reasoning with the kind of wisdom that only comes from 8 decades of life experience. "Roberto, Caro," she said in the gentle but penetrating voice that had been dispensing family truth for longer than any of us had been alive. "You talk about financial opportunities as if money is the only thing that has value, but Rosa didn't buy this land to make money. She bought it to make a family, and that family is worth more than all the hotels in Europe." Roberto's dismissive response to Aunt Carmela revealed something that I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe about his character. "With all due respect, Mrs. DeMarco," he said, using Aunt Carmela's formal name in a way that created distance rather than showing respect. "The world has changed significantly since Rosa's time. Modern families need to make modern decisions about how to manage their assets." The patronizing tone he used with our family matriarch was the final straw for Marcus, who had been controlling his anger with visible effort throughout the entire confrontation. "Don't you dare speak to my great-aunt like she's some confused old woman who doesn't understand the modern world," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. "Aunt Carmela has more wisdom in her little finger than you have in your entire body, and she understands family loyalty in a way that you clearly never will." Roberto's response was swift and revealing. "Family loyalty," he repeated with obvious disdain. "Is that what you call holding on to outdated traditions that prevent families from reaching their full potential?" The phrase "full potential" was clearly Roberto's shorthand for the kind of wealth and social status that his family represented, and which he'd apparently convinced Sophia to aspire to. "Our full potential," David said, "is raising children who know where they come from, and who value the sacrifices their ancestors made for them. Our full potential is continuing the traditions that have held this family together for 3 generations. And our full potential," I added, looking directly at Sophia, "is loving each other enough to protect what's precious instead of selling it to the highest bidder." Sophia's face crumpled at my words, and for the first time since her announcement, she looked like the daughter I remembered rather than the stranger she'd become. "I wasn't trying to sell anything," she said, tears starting to fall. "I thought—" Roberto said that his parents could help our family become more successful, More important, I thought I was doing something good for all of us. The admission that Sophia had been manipulated by Roberto and his parents into believing that giving away our family heritage would somehow benefit us was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Sophia, I said gently, success isn't about impressing people with expensive properties or international connections. Success is about knowing who you are and being proud of where you came from. Roberto apparently realized that his influence over Sophia was slipping, because his next statement was clearly designed to regain control over the situation by attacking our family's unity. This is exactly the kind of small-minded thinking that keeps families from achieving real success, he said, his diplomatic mask now completely gone. My parents have built an international business empire, and they were willing to include your family in that success. But if you're more interested in clinging to a piece of farmland than building real wealth, then perhaps we've overestimated your ambitions. The insult was unmistakable. Roberto was essentially calling us small-minded peasants who were too stupid to recognize the opportunity his family was offering us. But his attack on our family seemed to have an unexpected effect on Sophia, who looked up at her husband with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Roberto, she said quietly, you just called my family's heritage a piece of farmland. This isn't just property to us. It's where my great-grandmother built her life after coming to America with nothing. Roberto's response showed that he had no understanding of why his dismissive comment was hurtful. I'm not trying to insult your family's history, he said impatiently. I'm trying to help you see that honoring the past doesn't require being trapped by it. My parents could transform this property into something that would make Rosa proud while also generating significant income for everyone involved. Rosa would be proud of a hotel? Marcus asked incredulously. Rosa, who saved every penny she earned to buy this land so her family would always have a place to come home to? You think she'd be proud to see it turned into a business for strangers? Roberto's answer revealed the fundamental difference between his worldview and ours. Rosa was a businesswoman, he said with the tone of someone who thought he was being reasonable. She understood the value of making smart financial decisions. I think she would appreciate the opportunity to see her investment maximized. The characterization of Rosa's sacrifice as an investment rather than an act of love, was so tone-deaf that it left several family members shaking their heads in disbelief. But it was Sophia's response that really mattered, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new note of uncertainty about the man she'd married. Rosa didn't buy this land as an investment, she said slowly, as if she were remembering something she'd forgotten. She bought it because she wanted her children and grandchildren to have roots in America. She wanted us to have a place that would always be ours, no matter what happened in the world. Roberto looked frustrated by his wife's apparent change of heart, and his next statement revealed just how little he understood about the family dynamics he'd been trying to manipulate. Sophia, you're being emotional about this, he said dismissively. We need to think practically about what's best for our future and our children's futures. The mention of children seemed to hit Sophia in a way that previous arguments hadn't, and when she looked up at Roberto, her expression was sharp with a new kind of focus. What children? She asked. We've been married for 3 years, and every time I bring up starting a family, you say we need to wait until we're more financially established. Roberto's face flushed with embarrassment at having this private conversation exposed to our entire family, but his response was revealing. Children are expensive, he said defensively. We need to ensure that we have the resources to provide them with the kind of lifestyle and opportunities they deserve. What kind of lifestyle? Sophia pressed. The kind where they're raised by nannies while we travel for business? The kind where they don't know their grandparents because we're too busy building an international empire? For the first time since I'd known him, Roberto looked genuinely uncertain, as if he was realizing that his carefully constructed plan was falling apart in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sophia, he said, reaching for her hand across the table. We've talked about this. We agreed that we wanted to build something bigger than what either of our families had achieved. Sophia pulled her hand away from his with a sharp motion that suggested she was seeing their marriage with new clarity. No, she said firmly. You talked about building something bigger. I went along with it because I thought it would make you happy, and because I wanted to fit into your family. But I never agreed to give away my own family's heritage in the process. The admission that Sophia had been trying to fit into Roberto's family, rather than being accepted for who she was, revealed a great deal about the dynamics of their marriage, and probably explained much of her behavior over the past 3 years. Roberto's response showed that he had no intention of backing down from his plan to gain control of Villa Rosalinda, regardless of Sophia's change of heart. The offer from my parents stands, he said coldly. They're prepared to take ownership of the property and transform it into a world-class hospitality destination. If your family is too short-sighted to recognize this opportunity, then perhaps Sophia and I need to reconsider our connection to people who can't appreciate what we're trying to accomplish. The threat was unmistakable. Roberto was essentially demanding that we choose between keeping our family property and keeping Sophia in our lives. But his ultimatum had an effect that I don't think he'd intended. Instead of forcing us to capitulate to his demands, it seemed to crystallize for Sophia exactly what her husband was asking her to choose between. She looked around the table at the faces of family members who had loved her unconditionally for 34 years, then looked at the man who was demanding that she abandon them for his family's financial benefit. "Roberto," she said quietly, "I think it's time for us to go home." The dismissal was gentle but final, and I could see Roberto realizing that his plan had not only failed, but had potentially cost him his marriage in the process. As they gathered their things to leave, Sophia approached me with tears in her eyes and an expression that reminded me of the little girl she'd been before she'd convinced herself that she needed to become someone else. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how I let myself get so confused about what really matters." "We all make mistakes when we're trying to figure out who we want to be," I replied, pulling her into a hug that felt like the first genuine connection we'd had in 3 years. "The important thing is that you found your way back to yourself." As Sophia and Roberto drove away from Villa Rosalinda that afternoon, none of us knew whether their marriage would survive the crisis that his family's greed had created. But what we did know was that our family home was safe, our traditions would continue, and sometimes the people we love need to lose their way completely before they can find their way back to what really matters. 6 months have passed since that explosive family brunch, and as I sit on the terrace of Villa Rosalinda this warm October morning, watching my granddaughter Emma pick grapes in the same vineyard where her mother once played, I'm struck by how much has changed and how much has remained exactly the same. The villa itself looks better than it has in years. The trust arrangement I established has allowed Marcus, David, and Sophia to pool resources for maintenance and improvements that none of us could have afforded individually. David has redesigned the kitchen with professional-grade equipment that allows him to experiment with new recipes while honoring traditional techniques. Marcus has overseen restoration of the original terraced gardens that Rosa planted in the 1950s. And Sophia has surprised all of us with her contributions to preserving our family's legacy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The immediate aftermath of that confrontational brunch was more complicated and painful than any of us had anticipated. Sophia's marriage to Roberto didn't survive the week following their departure from Villa Rosalinda. The crisis had exposed fundamental incompatibilities that went far deeper than disagreements about property management. Roberto's ultimatum, demanding that Sophia choose between her family and his ambitions, had forced her to confront the reality of what their marriage had become. "He never loved me," Sophia told me during a tearful phone call 3 days after the brunch. "He loved the idea of what I could provide him: access to Villa Rosalinda, connections to an established American family, a wife who would help him build his parents' hospitality empire. But he never loved me for who I actually am." The realization was devastating, but also liberating. Sophia had spent 3 years trying to transform herself into someone she thought Roberto wanted, abandoning her own values and alienating her family in the process. The discovery that Roberto had been manipulating her feelings to gain access to our family's assets was painful, but it also freed her from the impossible task of earning love that was conditional on her willingness to betray everything she'd grown up believing in. The divorce proceedings revealed the extent of the Castellani's planning and the sophisticated nature of their attempted manipulation. Roberto's family had conducted extensive research on Villa Rosalinda's value and had been strategizing for months about how to gain control of the property. They'd used Roberto's marriage to Sophia as a gateway to studying our family dynamics, identifying weaknesses they could exploit to achieve their goals. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Sophia's divorce attorney explained to me during one of our meetings. "The Castellanis have used similar strategies to acquire properties throughout Europe, marrying into established families, gaining their trust, then manipulating inheritance laws and family relationships to transfer valuable assets to their hotel empire." The revelation that Sophia had been the victim of what amounted to a sophisticated long-term con game helped explain how such an intelligent, accomplished woman had been led so far astray from her own values and family connections. But understanding how the manipulation had worked didn't immediately repair the damage it had caused. Sophia's behavior during the 3 years of her marriage had hurt family relationships in ways that couldn't be erased, simply by recognizing that she'd been deceived. The process of rebuilding trust and repairing connections required time, patience, and genuine effort from everyone involved, but especially from Sophia herself. She began by reaching out individually to family members she had hurt or alienated during her years of trying to distance herself from our traditions. The conversations were difficult and sometimes painful, but they were also necessary for rebuilding the authentic relationships that had been damaged by her attempts to become someone she wasn't. "I need you to know how sorry I am," she told Aunt Carmela during a private visit that lasted 3 hours, and involved a great deal of crying from both of them. You tried to help me remember who I was, and I dismissed your wisdom because I thought I knew better. I was wrong about everything that mattered. Aunt Carmela's response was characteristic of the woman who had been our family's emotional anchor for 8 decades. Cara mia, we all make mistakes when we're young and trying to figure out who we want to become. The important thing is that you found your way back to your heart. But forgiveness from family members was only part of Sophia's journey back to herself. She also had to confront the ways that her pursuit of sophistication and status had led her to reject aspects of her heritage that were actually central to her identity. She enrolled in Italian language classes to reconnect with the linguistic heritage she'd grown up with but had allowed to atrophy during her marriage. She started spending time with older family members, recording their stories and learning family recipes that she'd previously dismissed as old-fashioned. Most importantly, she began volunteering with immigrant services organizations, working with recent arrivals who were facing challenges similar to those Rosa had encountered 70 years earlier. I want to understand what Nonna Rosa went through, Sophia explained to me during one of our weekly coffee dates that had become a crucial part of rebuilding our relationship. I took her sacrifices for granted, and I want to learn how to honor them properly. The work with immigrant families seemed to help Sophia process her own experience of feeling caught between two worlds, the one she'd grown up in and the one she'd married into. But instead of rejecting her background to fit into a new environment, she was learning to value her heritage as a source of strength and identity. The most significant test of our family's healing came 8 months after the divorce, when Sophia asked if she could bring someone to our monthly family brunch, a man she'd been dating for several months. His name is Michael Rossi, she told me nervously. He's a teacher, and he's Italian-American like us. His grandparents immigrated from Sicily in the 1940s, and he grew up hearing stories that sound a lot like the ones we tell about Rosa. I could hear in Sophia's voice that this relationship was different from her marriage to Roberto, built on shared values rather than mutual ambition, grounded in appreciation for family heritage rather than desires to transcend it. When Michael joined us for brunch at Villa Rosalinda, the contrast with Roberto was immediately apparent. Where Roberto had observed our family traditions with polite but distant curiosity, Michael participated with genuine enthusiasm and obvious comfort. He helped David in the kitchen, listened intently to Aunt Carmela's stories, and played bocce ball with Marcus's children, as if he'd been part of our family for years. He reminds me of your grandfather, Aunt Carmela whispered to me, as we watched Michael teaching 8-year-old Emma how to properly throw a bocce ball. He understands that family is something you build together, not something you join for personal advantage. But the real validation of Michael's character came from the children, who accepted him immediately and naturally in a way they'd never quite managed with Roberto. Emma started calling him Uncle Mike within hours of meeting him, and Marcus's son Tony began following him around the vineyard, asking questions about everything from grape varieties to Italian football. Kids always know, Jennifer observed as we watched Michael patiently answer Tony's endless questions about AC Milan's chances in the upcoming season. They can sense when someone genuinely cares about them versus when someone's just being polite. 6 months later, Michael proposed to Sophia in the vineyard at Villa Rosalinda, beneath the arbor where Rosa had held her first American family gathering in 1953. The proposal was simple and heartfelt. No elaborate staging or expensive ring, just a man asking the woman he loved to build a life with him in the place that represented everything she valued most. I want to be part of your family's story, Michael told Sophia, as he knelt among the grapevines that 4 generations of our family had tended. I want our children to grow up knowing they have roots that go deep and strong, and I want to help you continue the traditions that Rosa started. The wedding, held last month at Villa Rosalinda, was everything Sophia's first wedding had been, but with authentic joy replacing artificial sophistication. Instead of a string quartet playing classical music that had no connection to our heritage, we had Tony DeMarco and his Italian folk band playing songs that Rosa would have recognized from her childhood in Calabria. Instead of an elaborate sit-down dinner designed to impress guests with its expense, we had a family-style feast featuring recipes that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that food is love made tangible. Most importantly, instead of feeling like a performance designed to project an image of success and sophistication, the celebration felt like what it was: a family welcoming a new member who understood and appreciated what we were inviting him to join. This is what I should have had the first time, Sophia told me as we danced to That's Amore, under lights strung between the olive trees that Rosa had planted as a young bride, a celebration of love and family instead of status and ambition. The contrast between Sophia's 2 weddings reflected the deeper transformation she'd undergone, from someone who measured success by external validation to someone who understood that the most important achievements are often invisible to outsiders, but precious to the people who matter most. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been in how Sofia now approaches her role as a trustee of Villa Rosalinda. Instead of seeing the property as an asset to be leveraged or an obligation to be managed, she's embraced it as a responsibility to be honored and a gift to be preserved for future generations. She's taken the lead on documenting our family's history, interviewing older relatives and creating an archive of photographs, recipes, and stories that will ensure Rosa's legacy is preserved in detail. She's also spearheaded efforts to restore original features of the villa that had been altered over the years, working with preservation specialists to bring back architectural details that Rosa and Antonio had incorporated into the original design. I want Emma and the other children to understand exactly what Rosa built here, Sofia explained as she showed me the restoration plans for the villa's original kitchen hearth. I want them to see her fingerprints on this place, to understand that everything we have came from her courage and determination. The Emma she refers to is her daughter, born 3 months ago and named for my mother, Elena, a choice that brings our family's story full circle in the most beautiful way. Watching Sofia hold her daughter in the same kitchen where Rosa once held my mother, where my mother once held me, and where I once held Sofia, I'm struck by the continuity that seemed so threatened just 2 years ago. Emma Rossi will grow up at Villa Rosalinda the way Sofia did, learning to make pasta in Rosa's kitchen, playing hide-and-seek in the vineyard, and listening to stories about the brave woman who bought this land so her descendants would always have a place to call home. But unlike Sofia's first marriage, which sought to replace family traditions with something more sophisticated, Emma will grow up in a household that values those traditions as treasures to be preserved and shared. I want her to be proud of where she comes from, Sofia told me, as we watched baby Emma sleep in the same cradle that had held 4 generations of our family's children. I want her to understand that sophistication isn't about rejecting your heritage. It's about understanding how precious it is and being worthy of the sacrifices that created it. The trust arrangement I established has proven to be exactly what our family needed to preserve Villa Rosalinda, while allowing each of my children to contribute according to their abilities and interests. Marcus oversees the vineyard operations, which now produce a small but high-quality wine that we sell to local restaurants. David uses the villa's kitchen for catering events and cooking classes that celebrate Italian-American culinary traditions. And Sofia manages the property's historical preservation and serves as our family's unofficial archivist. The arrangement has also provided financial benefits that none of us had anticipated. The villa's wine sales, David's catering business, and occasional small events like cooking classes and wine tastings generate enough income to cover maintenance costs and improvements while preserving the property's character as a family home rather than a commercial enterprise. Rosa would be proud, Aunt Carmela said during last month's family brunch, looking around the terrace where 4 generations of our family were gathered to celebrate Emma's baptism. She built this place to bring family together, and that's exactly what's happening. But perhaps the most significant change has been in our family's understanding of what legacy really means. The crisis with Roberto and the Castellanis forced all of us to examine our values and priorities in ways that ultimately made us stronger and more connected to each other. We learned that preservation doesn't mean keeping everything exactly the same. It means understanding what's worth saving and finding ways to honor it while allowing for growth and change. Villa Rosalinda is more beautiful and functional now than it's been in decades, but it's also more deeply rooted in the values and traditions that Rosa established when she first walked this land 70 years ago. We learned that sophistication isn't about rejecting your background or aspiring to someone else's standards. It's about understanding the depth and richness of your own heritage and being confident enough to share it with others. Most importantly, we learned that love, real love, never asks you to choose between the people who matter to you. Real love brings people together rather than driving them apart, and it strengthens family bonds rather than exploiting them for personal gain. As I sit here on Rosa's terrace, watching my family gather for our monthly brunch, I'm filled with gratitude for the wisdom she showed in buying this land and the foresight I showed in protecting it through the trust arrangement. But mostly, I'm grateful for Sofia's journey back to herself and for the reminder that it's never too late to remember who you really are. The villa that Roberto tried to steal for his family's commercial empire will instead be passed down to Emma and her cousins, who will grow up understanding that some things are more valuable than money, and that the best inheritance isn't what you can sell, it's what you choose to preserve. Rosa's dream of creating a place where her family would always belong has survived 3 generations, and will survive many more, not because we've kept everything the same, but because we've understood what really matters and found the courage to fight for it when it was threatened. That's a legacy worth more than any hotel empire, and it's a lesson that Emma will learn not from lectures or stories, but from growing up in a place where love is stronger than greed and where family means more than profit. Sometimes the most sophisticated thing you can do is remain true to who you've always been, and sometimes the greatest success is measured not by what you've gained, but by what you've managed not to lose.